Hello and welcome to another video. This time we're looking at teachers and what does the poem teach us. Now remember, we're looking at these three things. This is what the examiner's looking for from your paragraphs. They want to see your ideas, quotations, you're using terminology, and we're going to look at AO3, which is what the writer is the reasons behind their choices. Now going back to a previous video, these are the three things that you've got to be thinking about. So the light bulb, your ideas, the cogs, the techniques, and then the last thing is the writer's thoughts and feelings towards the things. Now you can write about these in any particular order in a paragraph, but what you need to be doing is talking about all three in a paragraph. You cannot just write about one alone, because to talk about the techniques, you need to be linking to the ideas. To be talking about the ideas, you need to be linking into what the writer actually thinks. And so they are closely linked together. So don't think of, like in your paragraph, that you've got to start with your idea and then link in techniques. You can actually start with the writer's ideas and the writer's thoughts, then in the ideas and then into techniques. So these are interchangeable, which means that you can move them about within a paragraph. You don't have to follow a set structure, but if you want that security, you can start with an idea, link into a technique, and then go to writer's ideas. And this is where we've got it. So this PUT structure just gives you an idea of how to structure your paragraphs. Remember, each one is equally important. So miss one and you lose out when it comes to writing about the poetry. So what are the problems that we have when students talk about the teaching element? Well, these are the mistakes that students make. A lot of the time, they end their paragraphs or talk about the writer's message by just retelling the story. And they don't address the complexity of the poem or the text. Another thing is they just throw in historical answers and just sort of throw ideas. So for example, if they're talking about Dickens, they'll tell us about a sad story about Dickens's childhood, but then that has no meaning and no reference to anything else. And so they just chuck information that they've learnt rather than try and develop an idea. Limited understanding of the writer's context. So for example, if we're talking about Dickens, well, you know, yes, Dickens had a very bad childhood, but how does that impact him as a writer? And how do we see that? And why should it be an issue for him? Not exploring the message. Now, a lot of students, what they tend to do is they tend to state what the message is. So Dickens isn't happy with the way that the poor is treated, but they don't explore it in great detail. So they just put that statement and go, this teaches us that Dickens feels that the poor are treated badly. And the key question is, why? Why does Dickens think they are treated badly? Why does he feel his story and his book is appropriate for him to talk about it? And what is he hoping to get out of it? Those sort of things are things that help you develop your message and take it further. And again, this links in the same one before, not extending the thinking. What students tend to do is they just chuck an idea and go, this shows us how the poor were treated badly. This shows us that. And what we need from you is explanation. It's your explanation that gets you the marks, not just chucking something in there. And that's where students struggle sometimes with things. Sometimes students don't appreciate the complexity of the text. So there could be more than one message. And actually, that's what we want students to talk about. We want you to say that, well, it could be about this idea, but actually, I think the poet might be talking about this. And this is quite obvious, but some people just repeat the point. So they might say, oh, Dickens is trying to show us this. And at the end they go, Dickens is showing us this. And that's not taking anything further. Right, we're going to go back to our questions. And this is from a previous video, so you should see some repetition of ideas. We're just building on to an existing point that we've got there. So in the previous video we looked at, and if you want to see where this is, have a look at the uses video. So this was the idea that we had. So William Blake presents the idea that a place can limit a person's sense of freedom mentally rather than physically. And then we looked at what techniques we could use and what we could say about them. And then we said what was the impact on the reader, and then how we could link it into somewhere else in the text. So far so good. So that's our, in red it's our presents, and then in black it's the uses. So that's what we've got to do, and there's my paragraph building up bit by bit. This is where we take it further then, and we take it to the point of the writer. What is the writer teaching us? Now, if you have a look at the verbs on the left hand side, these are some good words to use in your writing, and you can use them for anything, for Shakespeare, for Dickens, for poetry, and even some of the non-fiction stuff that we're going to get round to later on. So when you have a look at this here, so you've got teachers. Now that's the basic thing, that's the message. What is Dickens trying to, or Blake trying to teach us, make us understand? But there's also these other verbs, so criticises. So is Blake criticising something? So he's saying something's bad in society. Is he attacking? So if he's attacking, he's focusing on one area, and he's kind of really drawing attention to that and saying, right, this has got to stop. Or is he an advocate? So an advocate is somebody that's trying to bring out something new. So is he an advocate for example, equality? Is he, an advocate for a change in society? Then we've got celebrate. So celebrates is looking for the good in something. So that's more of a positive. If you have a look at our other verbs so far, they're quite negative. And then we've got warns and exposes. So those key words are helping you to get the message, to talk about the message. You could just go, Blake teaches us, Blake criticises, Blake attacks. So what could we say with London, going back to our idea about what is the message behind it? Well, what we could say is Blake is teaching us the emotional impact of the Industrial Revolution. We're seeing with those marks of weakness and marks of woe how it's affected people. Blake could be attacking the way that governments have dehumanised the subjects in the society. He could be criticising authority. If we have a look in the poem, the church and the palace walls and the blood on the palace walls, we don't see any of that authority because they're in buildings. And so the people we see in the poem are the subjects, but we don't see those in authority. They're hidden behind walls. So we could see that Blake is attacking authority. We could also say that Blake is warning us about the divide in society. You know, we've got the blood on the palace walls, well, the blood from the soldiers, poor people, and the palace walls, obviously, nice palace, there is that divide there. Could be Blake exposing the slavery. We do know that from William Blake, he was a big person against slavery. So is what Blake is talking about here, about the mind-forged manacles, about how Blake is exposing how psychologically and mentally people are enslaved by industry? Or is Blake trying to expose how blind people are to what's really going on? And so we could spend ages, and we can go into this in quite a bit of detail. Now, when people look at something like this, they go, well, I can't find all of those, and I don't think I would have found all of those in the poem. We're not asking you to find all of those. You just need to talk about one. And if you want to be a bit more sophisticated, you could talk about two of those at the same time. So you could say Blake is attacking the authority and he's exposing the slavery. And then you've got a starting point for taking that a little bit further. And what I'd advise is you look at that vocabulary, look at the language that we've got there, you know, that dehumanization, the emotional impact, the authority, the class divide, slavery, blindness. You can see the words drive the explanation when you're talking about it. So what do I do next? So what's the next point? So I've got Blake teaches us this and I've got the idea. What do I do? Well, most students just go full stop and that's it. And really, that's not the end of the journey of explaining the message. So what you've got to do then is think a bit more and go, well, okay, if this poem is about slavery, where else do I see this in the poem? Where else do I see people being enslaved? We can say that repetition in every. If we have a look at that idea of the charted street, that idea that things are planned out, there's a sense of control. Another way you can go with this is you can think, well, why does the poet have this stance? So why is William Blake interested about the emotional impact of the Industrial Revolution? And you can then link in to say, well, he was a romantic poet, and so we know that they were conscious about the feelings and about emotions and how people were feeling. And so Blake is looking at society and looking at how people feel, and he was a very emotional person, so hence why we've got that stance that he's got there. He feels emotion, but he's shocked that these people are feeling this emotion. They're not sharing the same emotions. Another angle you can take is, well, what is the poet aiming to do? If we look at the idea of dehumanization of people, well, really what William Blake is trying to do is trying to make people wake up and realize what's going on and actually look at the impact of the Industrial Revolution on people. And another thing you can talk about is you can say what was going on at the time. Why should Blake be thinking this and want to teach us this? What was going on at the time? And one of the things for William Blake was the idea that, you know, the Industrial Revolution was seen as being this saviour for society, that it was so good and it was the best thing. And what Blake is trying to do is show us that actually it wasn't the best thing, that actually on the surface it might look good, but actually there's a deeper consequence to what's happening to the people. And so you can see, if you take that there, you can extend, and that's what I want to do, explain and explore the message in more detail. Now remember, we're comparing poems. So for this, we need to be thinking about comparing the different poems. So previous video, we talked about Wordsworth showing us the moment that someone realises they're not free and that something far greater is in control, which we said was very different to how people featured in Blake's London. And we used the example of towered up between me and the stars, the verb and metaphor, and we looked and we said that's what the ideas are and what we can feel from it, and we made another connection. And then we can take that further. Right, so let's have a look at how we'd approach it with extract from a prelude. So some of the things that we could talk about with that poem. So what is it trying to teach us? So one, it could be teaching us about man's arrogance, how man thinks he's in control when in reality he isn't. The power of nature, how powerful it is. Man's perception of himself. So how does he view himself? Does he view himself differently to others in society? And the duality of nature, how nature can be both good and bad. And we can kind of see that in the poem, because at the start of the poem it's all idyllic and perfect and beautiful, and then suddenly we have the big huge peak that appears, and suddenly it takes a darker tone. So there's a dual nature to nature itself. The Industrial Revolution. Then we've got this idea about how William Blake's was about showing the emotional impact. What we've got here with Wordsworth is showing us actually, well, Blake was talking about the city. What about nature and the rural environment? And so we're seeing here how actually, nature is in control. And this sense of freedom. So we've got those ideas, then you can start building it on and going, right, where else do we see this in the poem? Well, the man's arrogance, well, he steals a boat, doesn't he? He thinks he's in control, and he can do that. That's quite an arrogant thing to do. Why does the poet have this stance? Now, it's interesting, Wordsworth and Blake were both romantic poets, but what they do is they take their ideas differently in different angles. Whereas William Blake took the emotional aspect and he focused on the emotions and how people were feeling, Wordsworth taken another angle. And it is about the feelings, but it's different, and it's about nature. Whereas we're seeing with William Blake's, the city and the environment has affected people in such a negative way. What we're seeing emotionally different in this poem, extract from the Prelude, is that we've got man being quite arrogant and being quite in control and quite powerful, and suddenly he notices something about the nature and he's scared. And it's that change, a different emotional change in there. What is the poet trying to do? Well, the Romantics wanted to change society. They thought the Industrial Revolution was not a good thing, and they saw the problems with it. And so what you've got with Wordsworth's poem is trying to reevaluate and review nature and nature's importance and how man interacts with nature. And what was going on at the time, well, we know about the Industrial Revolution. So you can see all these things linked together, and we can kind of take it on further. Now remember, your comparison between the two different poems shouldn't really be about techniques, but should be about kind of ideas. So whereas, for example, Blake is looking about the emotional impact of the Industrial Revolution, Wordsworth is looking at the emotional impact of nature on man. So there's quite an easy connection that you can make between the poems, and that's the better point of comparison, because then you can say, oh, well, also it does this. So for example, if we look at man's arrogance in the Prelude, we can say, well, man thought he was, better than anything else. Do we see that in William Blake's poem? Yes, we do, because we see the palace walls, don't we? And we see the blackening church. So this idea that people lock themselves away, they think they're more powerful, whereas the ordinary person is left to suffer. So you can see those ideas there all together. So just to revise what we've looked at. So when looking at the poetry and writing your paragraph, what you've got to do then is use the put structure. So think about how it presents the issue. What does the writer use? So those are your choices. And what is the writer teaching us? And when you're looking at the teaching us, think about these words: teaches, criticises, attacks, advocates, celebrates, warns, and exposes. We will do more videos, so keep an eye on the YouTube channel, and we'll add more as we go along. And as I say, if you want to show me homework, send me a message, and I'll obviously have a look, see if I can make a video if there's something you're not quite sure about or you want a bit of help on.